Hello and welcome to CLOSEUP. It's the month of July, and at around this time of year we've gotten accustomed to an assembling of sorts with leaders coming from quite a number of settlements and villages across the country, and we're talking here about our indigenous brothers and sisters. It's the annual National Two Shows Conference, and I've got with me, in fact it's my distinct pleasure to have with me the Vice Chair, Mr. Lennox Schumann, who is also past Tushao of Pakuri, and so we're meeting with him ahead of the agenda, which is on the cards very soon. In a few days they will be meeting with leaders of the country and leaders of the varying settlements, as well as they coin a way forward to more or less set apart for the future of our indigenous brothers and sisters. Lennox, welcome to CLOSEUP.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Okay. I know over time there are quite a number of things on the cards that you've been talking about, including issues with land and a number of problems and challenges that our indigenous brothers and sisters are facing generally. What is on the top of that list as we get into the conversation?
I think the top of the list, first and foremost, would be ensuring that our leaders are prepared to execute their office or to operate in their offices. It's something that we've never done in the past. I don't think for the life of the NTC. We've never really seen any kind of training offered to the leaders. And this year, for the first time, we were actually going through that, giving them at least a baseline understanding of the various laws that affect indigenous peoples and how the laws are meant to operate in indigenous communities. We also intend on engaging ministers and so on, and seeing if there is anything that could be done from a policy position to address indigenous people's issues. Now, I understand that there have been a bit of shuffling with the agenda and some ministers may not be able to make it, but at the end of the conference, what we hope we will be able to achieve is to provide the government of Guyana a position that would represent the indigenous peoples, instead of just, you know, something is broken in my community, fix it, right? Mm-hmm. Getting out of this small complaints mechanism, looking at the bigger picture.
As we move forward, I'm happy that you're talking about that up front, because you would have only served not too long ago, and you understand clearly what are some of the challenges that the indigenous peoples face, some of the problems they face, but as well as how they deal with those challenges. And I'm sure it's worrying for you that their shortcomings, and as a result, to leadership and the skills that are necessary to handle the challenges that are ahead.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that people would look at indigenous peoples as is a bit timid and shy. And sometimes they walk into communities and the people just say yes, yes. Not really understanding, they're just saying yes because they just want to get rid of people. And in the past, they would have looked at that as an endorsement of their position without ever going to revisit them and getting a clearer understanding of that, right? That has caused us to be in a very disadvantageous position when it comes to a lot of issues, you know. And what we're hopeful, or we're hoping that we could get out of this conference, aside from the training, is how do we now empower our leaders to be able to speak on the issues instead of just taking them as they come and, you know, sacrificing what I'd say our community in that process.
Mm-hmm. Some of the problems that I know over years you've been dealing with, or matters you've been addressing back and forth, are problems that are still on the table. And if we can, let's talk about some of those problems.
Absolutely. We have a lot of problems that affect indigenous peoples, and I think in 2015 His Excellency had made some commitments, and to date we haven't really seen most of those commitments met. We had a commitment from the President in his 10-point plan to establish an Indigenous Lands Commission, right? We haven't seen that. Instead, what he attempted to do was to establish a commission that looked at two separate issues. And that's part of a bilateral agreement between the Kingdom of Norway and the Government of Guyana. We had seen a commitment to the revision of the Armenian Act, and so far we haven't seen that commitment making its way financially, right? They're saying, yes, we're undertaking this. In fact, I just saw a letter today that they're going to do consultations in Hururu, Kwakwani area. But we don't see the finances that are allocated to ensuring that that process is comprehensive enough. Take, for example, the revision of 2006 took close to $1 billion. And what this government has committed to this revision process is $25 million. So to us that demonstrates a lack of interest on the government's part in wanting to drive the revision of the Armenian Act. We have seen land issues. During the 28 years of the PNC, we had seen roughly 2.2 communities titled per year. During the PPP, we had seen that go down to 1.13. And during this administration, instead of titling of communities, not only did you not title communities, what we've seen is the government's attempt to pull those titles away. They've gazetted Anai as an NDC. They've attempted to include Campbelltown and Mycobia in the township of Mahdia. And there are a lot of things that are not happening that are respecting our land rights. And I think if we could get some of these issues dealt with, not only would indigenous peoples be in a better position, I think the whole country would be in a better position.
So it's obvious that you're not satisfied with the moves made and the promises that were given as it relates to the way forward. That's obvious.
That is very true. And it is not confined to one administration. We'll be very clear about that. I think both administrations have not only failed indigenous peoples, they've failed Guyana. And that's why we are in the position. And I think there's a question that you're going to ask.
Is the issue of land titling and land rights as simple as it seems? It's much more complex. Let's speak about it.
From our perspective, it is actually a very simple, I don't want to say issue, but it is an issue. It's a very simple issue. Because you said it in your very question there, the issue of land rights. It is a right that indigenous peoples have. So if we were to approach it from a rights-based perspective, then it is a very simple issue. All I ask is that you respect our rights, right? If you want to complicate it, what you could do is look at how the system would have failed, right? You have parliamentarians, ministers, and so on, their friends, who own mining blocks in indigenous communities. So obviously there's no interest on their part to have those things extracted from there, right? You have all of these mining blocks in Guyana owned by 40, maybe 40 people or so, right? So you're balancing the needs of 40 people against the needs of roughly 80,000 plus. I think that is very disproportionate, right? And just remember that, yeah, the indigenous people, right? Just remember that the indigenous people in themselves, we actually live in these areas. That's our grocery store. We go and hunt, we go and fish and all these things. I mean, just about last week, I think there was an article in the paper about the level of pollution in the Mazruni, right? And you can't go and eat fish from that river. You can't go and drink the water. Why? Because of the high mercury content in it.
It's been tainted.
So when you look at these things, the rights, let's say the financial gains of Forte is outweighing the rights of indigenous peoples. And I know that this is somewhat of a problem across a lot of countries that have an indigenous population. But it's now, how do we find a solution to that? I think that is our big question. And if I were to go a bit further, I think if we were to permit the system to operate as it currently does, remember we go from 2.2, 1.3, and now we've seen actually it's starting to go down. At some point, that downward trend has to be arrested before you start going up. And we're talking about rights here. We're not talking about, anything else. I think by virtue of that, just looking at how that graph would go, I would almost say that the next administration would actually continue down with that curve.
Because of the trajectory.
Yeah.
Has the conversation, because I know every year this is hot on the cards, and so the question is, has the conversation gotten to any measure or degree of positive or negative over the period of time? You're speaking a whole lot of negative. I'm wondering if there has been any iota in the positive direction that there could be continuity.
Not when it comes to land rights. We haven't seen that, right? In fact, 4 miles, for example, we've seen the government take away roughly 300 feet, which they're saying it's now going to be gazetted as a public road, and they're going to put a toll on that. What they're doing is taking away that land from the indigenous peoples. And while they're taking away that land, what we understand is that they're giving away the very land that they're slating for development. They're giving that away to people that they know. So basically, they're taking from us our rights and not only displacing us, but giving that to other people. You're asking about the positives. In all honesty, I would be hard-pressed at this point to speak of the positives. I think while we may have been given a lot of latitude as a National Two Shows Council to speak with some degree of independence, I don't think that the government is liking what they're hearing. And by virtue of that, you know, the president, for example, does not want to meet with the NTC. He had committed to meeting with us in March to speak about the same things, the same questions you're asking, right? And here we are, coming up to the end of July. And he had sent a letter for us to go and meet Minister Alicock, go and meet Minister Ramjatan, go and meet Minister Don Hastings before you meet me. So are we going to go through all of the ministers before we get to him? And even to that, I would tell you that Monday is going to get here, and the only time we're going to see the president is at the opening ceremony on Monday.
So you fear there's going to be no interaction?
Absolutely.
After that with
Correct.
the president?
Correct.
With the president. I know recently you made a comment that hit the airwaves, and of course, why not? And your comment spoke to the need of a party that speaks of an indigenous creation coming out from the indigenous people. It tells me that you're not satisfied, and as I said earlier, you're just not satisfied with any of the two administrations that have served, both the one present and the one past.
I would say you are correct in that statement. Everything that we do is based out of need, right? Why do we wear clothes? It is because we need to protect our bodies. Why do we eat? Our body needs that stuff, right? So for us, venturing into that frame, it is based on need. If we have not seen our issues addressed in that sense, then we need to have a stronger voice. And our stronger voice isn't how loud we can sing. It is what kind of force or authority is behind that voice when you speak. And right now, as an NTC, we could make a lot of noise. But that's all the government is going to say, man, let them make all the noise they want. We're going to do what we want, right? But I want to correct that statement that you made. We are not looking at an indigenous party. We're looking at a party that has its base in indigenous communities, right? So there must be a clear distinction there. We're looking for the people who have been disenfranchised by the 52 years of non-action in that sense. We're looking for the people who are left out, not only economically but socially, from both parties. And I say both parties because we know that there's no AFC, right? And I see you smile. It is a reality on the ground that we all understand, we recognize that. And what we want to do is to take all of our issues, collective issues, and see how we put these things in the national development. Remember, yes, we have a lot of issues in indigenous communities, but I don't see Guyana affording a third ethnic party, right? We've already divided the country in two. Why are we going to now divide it in three? If we're dividing it in three, then you might as well just send the two off and let's get a centrist movement. Bring everyone who is looking out for the national development of Guyana, the nation in that sense. Bring them to the center. And indigenous issues would be one of the core components of that. When I say issues, I'm speaking it from a rights-based perspective also, right? So indigenous rights will obviously be one of the centerpieces of that. But we're also looking at constitutional development. And obviously black gold starts to flow in 2020. If we continue in this current system, who knows what's going to happen? We can only assume from where we sit.
Okay. Before I go to the agenda of the party coming out of the indigenous setting. You made mention just now that there is no AFC, and I don't want that to slip me. Why there is no AFC? I want to hear from you.
Yes,
Why do you see that?
well, permit me to answer a question. Question. You tell me about when the AFC would have presented a position that was different from the PNC. In the 3 years that they've been in government, I haven't seen it. Right? There are a lot of things that are happening on the ground that the AFC is silent on, and these are things that affect people, day-to-day lives, right? In fact, if I were to go so far as to say that to a certain extent they have, well, not to a certain, I think they have been completely subsumed by the PNC. How else are you going to pretty much infringe upon one's right to freedom of speech? You present a sedition clause hidden away in a bill. You do not permit the public to vet it until such time as you present it at Parliament, and then you're going to say, well, we're looking out for the interests of the people. Had that been there at this point, I bet the police would be knocking at that door looking to arrest Lennox Schumann.
Because it's a dream, not only a dream, but it can become reality. The whole idea of the party. So a party coming out of an indigenous setting, inclusive of all, you did say, from persons who are ostracized or probably neglected from both parties who can join. You have no problem with that. How will you work it? And I'm interested in how you're going to work this around. Bearing in mind, you just spoke of an example of the first coalition setting in the country, which obviously in your mind has failed.
Yeah, correct. I think that is a discussion mark that I think we need to leave for September or November or December, or whenever maybe August, when we have an opportunity to have a discussion with our grouping.
Okay.
I think what is more important for us to focus right now on would be the NTC conference, and why it is so important that leaders are focused on the discussions, right? At least our discussions and throwing our remark out there to see what kind of support comes back for this political movement, because we don't have a party, it's a movement to try to influence change. That actually came out of a lot of discussions that happened at the local level, and most of that actually started in 2016. In 2016, we had attempted to sign for the very first time a peace treaty between all 9 nations, stating that we are not going to be fighting with each other in this sense. To a great extent, that would have dealt with, our border issue with lands and stuff, right? It also would have united the indigenous peoples. And what the government did is completely scrap that plan, right? Remember, he who pays the piper calls the tune. In 2017, which was last year, we had attempted to come to a consolidated position, to present that position to the government and show where the system needs to be corrected, right? And we were obviously going to offer recommendations. Instead, what we had was that process being completely circumvented by the government, where they chose to have ministers meet the leaders in the evenings. Now, when you meet a minister, it provides, and you say, Minister, look, my toilet is broken in my school and I'd like it fixed. You know what, thank you, I'm going to take note of that and get... Leaders walk away with the perception that by telling a minister about their problem and the minister says, I'll look into it, they think that the problem is going to be solved, right? But when they go back on the ground, it is the reality that they move into that it doesn't get resolved, right? So this year, what we want to do is just to empower leaders in how to put their agenda forward. And I think that the government and the opposition have understood for a long time that the indigenous vote is a swing vote. And I think that posed a threat to them in 2016 when we attempted to have this peace treaty signed and so on and so forth, come from a consolidated position. They also undermined that process last year again. So they're trying their best to ensure that the indigenous peoples are not united, because when we start to speak with one voice, I think it would be change that they are uncomfortable with, right? They want to look out for their politics. We want to look out for the people, right, and the nation. And I think next week, for example, if you think that if they think that we don't know the value of our votes, Monday night it's a social hosted by His Excellency. Tuesday night, a social hosted by Honorable PM. Wednesday night, actually, that is something that we have planned for female leaders, which would empower them. But I was made to understand that the Honorable Minister of Natural Resource wants to host the leaders. Thursday night, the leader of the opposition wants to host the leaders. Friday night, the ministry wants to host the leaders. So obviously, they're not hosting the leaders because they genuinely want to address their concern. What they're looking at is maybe pulling these leaders in and buying them a few drinks, appeasing them, and then they're going to go back and say, oh yeah, this government is great, without ever looking at addressing the problems. I think what they're trying to do is just buy the problems out of the people. And I think that's a wrong approach. Why can't we just have one event, right? And if you're talking about national unity, which I think they have all of these fancy things that they're trying to do. If you want to talk about national unity, why not just have both the president and the leader of the opposition and all the ministries who want to just throw one social so that you could interact with all of them at one gathering? Why separate events? Separate events are there to simply politicize the leaders in themselves. They don't have any interest in addressing the issues. That is why they're taking that approach.
So it's obvious that there is no trust here. There's obviously no trust here with the agenda that's being put forward by those in power right now. Or should I say there is a fear that the initiatives that are being placed are not genuine as they seem?
Correct. Correct. You'd be correct in that assessment. We don't see it that they genuinely care for the indigenous peoples in that sense. They're politicking with the leaders, and that's been that way. I can't say it's only in this administration. I think under the PPP administration, the leaders were not allowed to even go and have a discussion with the opposition. So while this is welcomed freedom in this sense, right, why should we feel like we owe you something for giving us our freedom, right? Why are we in this position having this kind of conversation?
What is it going to take from you as vice chair of the NTC to reach to that place where, yes, I believe this is starting ground, that we can have a respectable conversation, and that I believe that you are genuinely interested in the concerns we have, and we could move from this point to a point that is realistic, where we can be comfortable?
I think all it would take is just a genuine discussion and a genuine commitment. We have seen commitments from all administrations in Guyana. We've even seen commitments from Her Majesty when she left to addressing indigenous land issues, and here we are 52 years post-independence and nothing. Actually, we also understand that preceded Her Majesty's entrance into Guyana, right? When the Dutch handed over Guyana to the Brits based on whatever settlement they had, they wanted to ensure that the indigenous peoples are not harmed in any way and their land rights were being respected. So the Brits committed to that. And when the Brits left, they asked this government to commit to that. So obviously those...
It's an ongoing...
Exactly. So those kingdoms would have seen the importance of indigenous peoples and indigenous peoples' rights. And it is unfortunate that here we are sitting 52 years later, and we still cannot have a genuine commitment from either side to addressing those issues. If they want, personally, I think that for us to not start a political movement, to me that would have been the most ideal, because it would mean that the government is fulfilling its obligations to its people. But we simply jumped into the fray because they haven't been doing that. Right? Remember I said everything is birthed out of need, and I think this is what the country needs. And We just want to be the voice of reason at some point. We don't want to go in there and just say, you know what, your party says this, your party says this. Let's have a very sober discussion on the issues, and let's come to some very, very fair commitments on both sides. How do you respect indigenous rights while still looking out for national development? You can't say that the Forte people who own mining blocks are making that much contribution to the national economy. It is an argument that cannot be proven. You could say, yes, we produce so much gold. Yeah, but look at the two big mining companies in Guyana and how much they produce.
Lennox Schumann, Vice Chair of the NTC, it was my pleasure having you on board. And we do wish the National Two Shows Council, of course, this conference is one of the cards. Success. We hope that you'll be able to meet with the leaders. We hope that you'll be able to establish that which you haven't been able to do in a long, long time. The trust which is necessary to move this process forward, because I think it's been like this for far too long. And I believe it's important that there is a meeting point where both the leaders and the people of this country, along with the two Shaws and the indigenous people who are all part of, who are all Guyanese, to move on together in a cohesive way.
Well, if I were to jump in there a bit, I think one of the things that we have not seen, we toyed with the idea, right? We simply put it out there and looked and see if anyone would come to the table. Had you had a willingness to address the issues, you would have simply said, look, folks, we understand that this is the path you're going. I want to know why you think we've gotten to this point. To date, neither side has actually reached out and say, look, let's have a discussion on why you think this is what's needed, or how we got to this point, and let's do a good analysis of it, and let's have a good discussion with it. None.
Thank you very much for coming, sir. Lennox Schumann, Vice Chair of the NTC.
My pleasure.
I'm Mark Watson. Until our next program of Close Up, do take care. Goodbye.